Play, Watch, Listen is a mostly games industry podcast featuring mostly game developers, and it is funded entirely by supporters on Patreon.
Everybody, this is going to be a slightly shorter episode than normal because Mike and I were just basically doing the podcast without doing the podcast because we were talking about things we weren't allowed to. But it was so on brand. If anyone's ever wondered, this podcast is literally just us having a conversation, and there's no difference between the hit record and the not hit record.
I described it to someone the other day as we have like an hour and a half, 2 hour conversation, and we record the middle of it basically every week. That's what we do. So we were talking about combat. We were talking about combat design.
Mm-hmm.
So I was saying we were talking about, and keeping it very vague about both of our NDA things. We were talking about combat design. And I said we have a term for that in my team, which is called Warcrafting. Mm-hmm. I don't think this is. And I said, do you know the one about the Warcraft session duration? You don't. No. So this is one of my favorite game design things that ever happened. So early on in Warcraft, I think it was a couple of years in, they realized that Warcraft was really fucking addictive, right? They realized that people were playing the game for absurd durations, like 6-7 hours straight, and on the one hand, if you're a company, you're like, well, that's good, they're engaging with our stuff, it's win. But what they realized was it was burning people out. People were not wanting to play the game. They were playing to a point where they were making themselves like sick. They were enjoying the pizza, but then they ate too much pizza and then had stuff.
What an interesting design problem to have.
It's a real design problem.
Wow.
So what they did, so solution one, draft one of this idea, was they said, no worries. What we're going to do, this is really clever. We're going to disincentivize people from playing that long. So what we're going to say is, you know what? After 2 hours or 3 hours, I can't remember what the number was, but after X amount of time in World of Warcraft, you're going to earn 50% XP. You're just going to halve the XP you're earning. So you are punished basically for sticking around. So we're going to put up a thing on screen that says, you've played for too long, you're no longer getting your 50% bonus. The audience rebelled and got so fucking angry. Yeah. And they got livid. There was internet burned down on World of Warcraft because how fucking dare you? I'll play the game. I'm a grown up. I'll play the game for as long as I like. Why would you insult my experience?
Yeah, it's not the Wii.
And then a genius on the World of Warcraft team, I don't know who this is, but I hope they get the credit they deserve one day, said, I've got an idea. Let's double the XP requirement of everything in the game, and let's make it you don't lose XP earning after 2 hours, but for the first 2 hours you play, we'll give the player 200% XP. And someone on the team said, but that's the same thing. And he said, no, it fucking isn't. And they released that to praise and excitement from the community, because thank you. You're meaning that every time I come on every day, I get like the first couple of hours, I just get bonus XP. That's amazing.
And it incentivizes people to play for 2 hours a day rather than for playing 12 hours straight or whatever.
And we call it Warcrafting. It's basically, if you want to use any numeric system to kind of encourage a behavior for the player, and obviously, like all game design, this can be used for evil as well as good, but let's assume we're using it for good only. You don't take anything away from them, you give them more if they do the thing you want.
That makes sense.
And mathematically, it's exactly the same, but it's not in terms of feel. It feels better to get bonus.
That is super interesting.
And I gave you a bit of advice, which was basically to do that, essentially, in your thing that you were talking about.
And I will pitch that because it's a great idea. You're not wrong, Mike. Wow. Everyone, Austin is planning to join us today, but he's busy. We're sandwiched in between 2 meetings. Look at him working in December.
Busy man.
I thought the whole industry.
He goes into one meeting and he plays with one hand, diddle-diddle-dee, and then he goes into the other meeting and he goes diddle-diddle-da, and then he leans across the table and he says, you know what if we play them at the same time? And that's how the magic happens.
And they go, give him the money, and that's
this man all the money.
And that's why Austin loaded. I don't know if he is. I have no concept of how much money
we should check in. We'll off mic. We'll open our bank accounts.
Austin, how you doing financially? I literally have zero clue what his finances look like. We were also talking about an interesting combat problem that can come up in general of players will do the easiest thing possible, even if it bores them. And I think there are a lot of, like I've said this maybe even on the podcast recently, I wish games had the option to turn off collectibles so that I could hit a button and there would be none in the game and I would not have any counter telling me to find them, because I will go out of my way to clear that checklist to collect them all, but I really don't
to the
find
detriment
that,
of your enjoyment.
Yes, I do not find it fun. And I'm recognizing that the action that I am doing, the way that I am choosing to play the game, even if it's optional, is making the game less fun for me. It's making me pay less attention to the story. It's making me pay less attention to the environments because I'm just looking for fucking collectibles. But I can't stop myself from doing it. And I feel like there are so many things that players probably aren't even consciously aware of that feed into that same thing. Like we said, if you make something spammable, if you make even if it means someone's just hitting X over and over and over again in a boss fight, they will do that because it's the easiest way to achieve the goal of beating the boss, even if it's a less fun way to play. And that's a really also interesting video game specific problem. I can't think of anything else that really applies to, where you just have to be consciously aware that players will do the boring thing and dislike your game by their own choice. And so you have to find ways to stop them from doing that. It's such a specific weird problem that you have to solve as part of game design.
Yeah, people choose the shortest path. It's I think I've read like in like city planning, this is an issue that nobody will go into the park unless you give them a reason to. Everyone knows it's a good idea to touch grass, to see nature, but generally everyone's in a hurry somewhere, so you kind of have to design spaces to force people, and they'll then be happier. They'll then prefer your city to anyone else's because they went to nice places, but they won't choose to.
Wow, humans.
Yeah,
man.
We suck.
We're
just not that bright. To be honest.
So many things. I don't know how to pronounce the name of the author, but I've been doing this thing this year. I might have spoken about it already, where I read a fiction book and then a non-fiction book, and so I just jump between the two. So I'm getting like
page by page or one after the other.
No, that would be crazy.
That'd be amazing. Yeah.
And I read my favorite book I've read this year is We. It's a Russian dystopian novel by Yevgeny Zamyatin, often anglicized as Eugene Zamyatin. Written a really long time ago. He was basically like kicked out of Russia for even writing the book. Because it's very political, and it has so much, even though it's a very fictional setting, clearly very fictional.
Recording.
Very similar to oh, there he is. There's that man.
Hey, sorry, I suck.
No, you're okay. We were just talking about how much she sucks.
We're talking about Russian non-fiction.
Yeah, I'm talking about Russian
join us.
No, this one is fiction. But it's got so much about how humans are obsessed with math. And it's written as though it's in the future, and it addresses like current times as though we're all crazy and insane, and that searching for our own happiness by just meandering and having all this power is redundant, and that if the government schedules exactly when we have enjoyment periods and what we do in them, we would be much happier. And the thing that gets me is it's probably not fucking wrong. That like if there's a whole thing about loss of freedom leading to government forced happiness, and they consider it a sickness in the book if anyone stops doing things by the precise schedule that they are required to, which obviously we don't want. We like freedom, but there are so many things in there that I'm like, if you scheduled a mandated go for a walk and enjoy the sun time and you had to do it, people may actually be happier because there's an interesting,
like, it can lead to very bad places, but there is an interesting philosophical debate about the impact of freedom on people and whether we are best served by it. I like being free.
Huge fan. Yeah.
Huge fan. But there is an interesting, because it's not, the majority of people who've ever lived have not lived with freedom. Right? They've not. And
what is the book that this is bouncing off of?
We by it's very popular, and thus I feel so bad about getting the name wrong because I'm sure it's a Russian writer. It's Yevgeny Zamyatin. Very well known, like considered to be one of they call it Dystopian trilogy alongside Brave New World and 1984.
Sounds like a fun week.
I was going to say it's extremely Orwellian from your description so far.
It actually inspired Orwell. So it is the book that made Orwell write the way that he did. Again, is it 1984? It is, right? I always forget.
84 is very much the idea of
so
everything being very structured and enforced by.
It's even more specific in We, and they say different things. Like obviously 1984 is very much about thought police, and I feel like that's like the biggest consistent is what you think is what matters. And not that it doesn't in Wii as well, actually, but it's really specific to like they're told how to make art, and they feel like any art that we would have made now is structureless and insane, and that it's primitive, that we found it interesting or beautiful, because what does it mean? It's just, I don't know. I've gone down this thread this year of humans being really obsessed with math. There was a period, I think it might have been Korean, no, they have also done it in English, where a bunch of words were removed from the dictionary in the name of efficiency, but basically they just made it so that words all have opposites. Or like, there is this version, and anything else in between is gone. And so there are a lot of various languages that have basically been mathed so that we have efficiency, even though it removed some of the color from our language. Just really...
And it changes as well. I've talked to like bilingual or trilingual friends who are like, my brain functions differently when I'm talking in each language. Like I am a different, like, not person, but a different organizer of my thoughts when I've got... That's wild to me.
I lived with a Japanese girl for a while, and she would always complain that English is really boring. She'd be like, "Oh, what? Very tired?" Like she'd complain.
She wasn't referring to you when she said English, right?
I mean, maybe
it wasn't like a personal attack.
Not a criticism I've not heard before. No, it was specifically about like not being able to express herself in a colorful way. That like I guess she was of the impression that people, when they speak Japanese, speak in a way that's quite poetic, or at least a little more romantic. Whereas in English...
I mean, English people definitely say the same about German. Like, German's seen as a very efficient,
specific,
unromantic
yeah,
language.
It's true, yeah.
I always wonder how much of those views of language are, like, rooted in bigotry rather than like, the reality of the language, or, like, pop culture, especially in the case of German. Like, most German accents you've seen or heard in media have obviously been kind of bad guys or scientists, right? Like, I definitely think that having an English accent makes people think I'm smarter than I am because of the associations.
That's definitely a thing.
By the way, do you have the version of Wii that has like a forward by Margaret Atwood and afterward by George Orwell?
Yes.
Which is like the best structure of a book ever.
Yeah.
Okay, I just bought that.
I really do recommend reading
That's
it.
really that's intriguing to me.
I also love the way it's written, and I have issues with Orwell's writing in that sometimes I feel like he just wants to write an essay, but instead wrote a book. 100%. And I mean, there's like an 18-page bit in the middle of that book that's just an essay, whereas I really did not feel that way. So I actually strongly disliked Brave New World.
That's Huxley.
Yeah, that's Huxley. That's what. Sorry, because they're considered the dystopian trilogy, so they recommend you read those three back to back, which is what I did. Yeah, Brave New World. I just didn't like that book at all. Like, it starts with eugenics and then gets into kids having sex with each other, and then I just, not even thematically, I can handle some dark themes in a book, but I didn't like the way it was written so much, and I didn't none of the themes were as remarkable to me, outside of, I do like the thing in that book where they won't let you like invent a new sport unless it requires more tools than every previous sport, because they're just so obsessed with consumerism, which I thought was pretty interesting. But speaking of Germans,
hi.
I'm so sorry to every German who's watching this, if we have any. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. Has anyone played it?
Yes.
I've played more than half of it, I think. Probably 2/3 or so.
I just got to Giza.
Awesome, me too.
How far am I in? Is that about the same? You're about the same place?
I think I'm probably near the end of the Giza bit.
I'm just about to get to Giza, according to what my Twitch chat told me.
Okay.
Thoughts? How does everyone feel about it?
I think it's great. I genuinely think it might be about to elbow Astrobot out of my Game of the Year slot.
No way.
I think Astrobot is still safely my Game of the Year.
Me too.
But yeah, I really like it. I like that it is it gamifies the bits that we associate Indiana Jones with very well. It's not a skin on something. It's not an Indiana Jones skin suit on a different thing.
Uncharted or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. I like that. Also, they go out of their way to, like, one of the things that made Indiana Jones such like my primo, like, I literally got a bullwhip and shit as a kid. Like, I was just, Indiana Jones was one of those heroes that absolutely was above the rest for me. And part of the reason why is that for all of the adventurism, he's also so smart. He speaks all these languages, and he's so cultured in the world, and the fact that that it's like he's very silly, and he makes silly moves and funny faces and all that stuff, but he's fundamentally like a genius. And I think that the game does a great job at not gliding past any of that. There's so many, and also things like, it's not trying to be Myst or something like that, but there's a lot of kind of environmentally puzzles that you can just skip but it's actually satisfying to kind of work out how to do them. And it feels like a thing Indy would do, and I'm like, they've done a good job at gamifying a character trait of his. I remember Troy also mentioning they gave him this great, like fancy bullwhip, and that ironically he never actually used it because it was a pillar of their design that Indy never used the whip in cutscenes when you prefer to do it in game. And so,
take that away from you, yeah.
Yeah, and I feel that
seems
as
a bit
well.
cruel to give him a whip then and tell him he's not allowed to use it. That's,
exactly. It was a winking complaint on his part. I don't remember when it.
He's
came
incredible,
up,
by the way.
Oh my god, he's
so
good.
It's a shame he's not here. I was gonna poke him to see if
I did
could
also
wrap him
consider
in.
asking him, but I figure he's very busy, and I figured we would have.
And he's
trouble
probably talked
scheduling
about
this
that
week.
game a lot, right?
Well, it's that I was like, we're probably going to have to move this week. We only have to move by an hour, but still, I feel like December's hard. But
I texted him,
sometimes
like,
it doesn't.
the VO. Sorry.
Sometimes it doesn't sound like I can hear a little bit of Troy occasionally, but sometimes it's just fucking Indiana Jones, and yeah. And
no, he's not trying to do an impression.
Good, but the thing that gets me is that, like, again, he's a very good actor, but it's that he's doing an impression and acting. Like, you can hear all of the emotion. Some people, or most people, can only do one of those things. You can do the impression, and then you're always in the whatever emotion the quote is, and you can't really extend outside of that. Troy also delivers a fantastic performance. Like, it is really, really impressive.
He inhabits it. I think he's excellent. And I think there's a lack of. There's kind of and I know this from. We all know this probably from conversations with Troy about this part in particular. There's a humility to that performance. Like, he is very willing to step back. He's not putting, I can't hear Troy in it because he knows that's not the assignment. He's absolutely producing that character. I don't think it's like a lazy impression, but it feels like he's carrying the part for Harrison Ford. It's got that kind of quality, and that shows such a respect
deeply reverential.
and humility.
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing that I text him about, like, genuinely, I've heard a lot of respect for the vocal performance. I think his physical performance is even more impressive. Like, the way he's moving in those cutscenes, just that kind of, he's got that swagger.
Very indie. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
But also the awkwardness.
Sorry.
There's also the
exactly.
awkwardness.
It's the thing you said, that
silly
clumsiness, that kind of bookish nature. Yeah, it's all there. He's brilliant.
It's also interesting that you can see in his face that it's a combination of Indiana Jones and Troy because of the PCAP. But I like that. Like, every time that I'm seeing Troy, it's like an Easter egg because it's so rare. Like you
catch a little in the eyes and nose.
That looks like Troy. Definitely. Yeah, it's kind of fun. But it's
great.
I think the whole cast is actually very, very, very good, which is so important for a game that's very cinematic. I just feel like, and this is not a thing that I say very often, this game feels really innovative. Like, it is it's sort of like nothing else I've played. The closest you can kind of compare it to is Hitman, Dishonored, Thief, but even that's unfair. I was expecting a lot of combat because that's what the studio is known for. I love their combat. I'm a big fan of the way they write stories. Obviously, this is also a really fun story. But I did not expect, a Vatican sandbox full of Assassin's Creed style secrets.
You don't get a gun. Or I didn't get a gun till the last moments before Geese. I'll put it that way. The last moments before Geese. I didn't have a gun. Like, that's...
And it feels weird to use
great.
it. I have... Yeah. Like, you can take them off when you get to Giza, a lot of the Nazis carry them, and you can grab them, but I always flip them over into melee mode because it just doesn't feel like Indy to run around like a fucking sort of Rambo type.
Yeah.
Because, like, obviously his one of very few iconic gunshot moments is like a comedic bit.
Yeah.
He's such a like brawler And I love that they use all these classic sound effects, like the indie punch, the Ben Burt sound effects that are, it's just, I'm like, it's clearly just, it's made from a place of love and totally gets the vibe. And I play the game differently as a result. I likewise did not expect the kind of Assassin's Creed, but again, it somehow feels very loyally indie.
Well, it's what you said. It all flows from the IP, and I think that's to me that's the thing that's exciting about IPs in games, and it's what we try to do with John Wick. It's what we're doing with Tron. Like I think when you try and set out to make a game that is about which is truly about the IP and the verbs of the IP and what the fantasy of being that character is, I think you're kind of almost forced into exactly what Lana's describing of like, it doesn't really fit in an existing category because it shouldn't. It's an Indiana Jones game. Like this is a very specific energy. And I think that's what's, to me as a designer, that's what's most interesting about IP-based games. And yeah, so this one definitely has that feeling of, you wouldn't make this game unless you're making Indiana Jones. Like if I think the game's been well received, I'm sure we'll see people maybe try and like, if not clone it, like definitely take big chunks of it. But it's not going to feel right because you're not playing indie anymore. And I think that's the thing that's exciting to me. The other thing for me that is very specific, actually, just kind of to my kind of taste playing it is, I'm fascinated by the kind of what's the word? Kind of parallel production process of Disney and what Disney's doing in games, because obviously I'm experiencing that firsthand. Because a lot of the same people are overlapping between these Disney projects, there's almost this interesting chain, almost like following a studio,
John Drake,
of decisions you're seeing. I mean, John Drake especially, and lots of other brilliant, talented people. Like, you can see that through line from like the Avatar game, Star Wars Outlaws.
I also actually really like the Avatar game.
I think there's some really smart stuff for me, and this is kind of one of those things that's only useful to me. Is it's really interesting seeing similar notes or ideas that I know have been brought to me by Disney. Kind of, how did the indie guys do it? Oh, they got that same note, they got that same conversation, and what was their angle on that versus what the Star Wars Outlaws guys' angle? You know, that's. I think in a few years when we all can talk about this process, I think that'll be really interesting to kind of have that conversation, because I think there's an interesting kind of, like I said, kind of a
I'm going to look out for that now. Be like, what is the Disney publishing advice that they're consistently giving these very different games?
Well, there's and other things like when because obviously when you're working on this stuff, you have awareness of other projects, but you're not like, I'm not playing Indiana Jones builds. Like, I don't have that level of access, obviously. But what will often happen is we'll be having a problem, and I'll be talking with someone at Disney about that, and they'll be like, we're working on another game, and we solved it by doing XYZ on that game. And then I'm playing Indiana Jones, like, oh, it's the bit that they got me to rip off. I didn't know. And this is I learned this lesson from this game. That's super boringly specific, but I think there's an interesting thing here because I think we are going to see more IP-based games kind of going forward generally. I think the companies like Disney that are taking a very kind of respectful, hands-on position are almost going to have their own style, their own house style, in the same way as the studios do. And when you see that blend with, how does Machine Games respond to that versus Ubisoft versus Bithell? Like, what's the kind of the babies
I'm gonna look out for that now, like an Easter egg.
It's fascinating. Yeah.
I have the perspective of someone who does not really care about Indiana Jones. I've seen those movies, but they never really did anything for me. Like,
I'm kind of with you. Like, they're fun, right? They're good movies, but like, I didn't have a whip as a child.
I recognize they are good films.
It was an adult.
I've seen
Last
them
Crusade,
once
I think, is a top 5 of all time, all genres.
I wouldn't even disagree with you, Austin. I think that it's effectively a perfect film. When I was first streaming it, I was praising the opening segment of The Great Circle so much. I was like, this is so well written. I love what the fuck? This is so good. And then people were like, it's the movie. And I was like, oh, I haven't seen it in so long that I didn't register that it was just the movie.
Shot for shot.
And I was like, this is really good writing. I kept praising it. And it was
I remember Troy.
Doc Ock seems like he might be trouble. Yeah.
I seem to recall Troy telling me when he got back from shooting that opening that they would play the score on the motion capture stage of the opening in order to make sure that it was all like
Timed?
beat for beat,
Wow.
precisely as the films. I could be remembering that slightly wrong.
They're hitting as well the movement cues, like it's
all
on.
there. Yeah,
it's really well done.
Yeah,
and again, doesn't feel. That is definitely impression. They're definitely doing an impression. They're definitely mimicking what was there, but it's done to such a high standard that it feels natural, and you would be forgiven, as you say, Lana, for not realizing that was something that was.
Well, yeah, it doesn't feel like.
When's the last time you watched the third film, Alana? Or Mike?
The third film I watched maybe like I've only seen them all once, so maybe like 2 years ago was the first time I watched. It's the first and last time I watched it. Why do you ask?
Because for me, that is a rewatch every few years. It is a flawless. A friend of mine once phrased it: the chemistry between Sean Connery and Harrison Ford is the best romance ever seen on screen.
It is,
and that to me, it is it because they found a way to take the perfection of Raiders and go, but what if the entire time he's back-footed because his father is better at everything, and it just adds that extra level of it's not just funny, but it adds a whole other layer. I mean, it has also one of my favorite tragic father-son scenes ever, because it goes by like that, but it's very Spielberg, the way that he's always exploring those kind of intergenerational relationships, and the scene where they're on the airship, and Harrison Ford he's like finally got a chance to talk to his dad, and he's like, you were never there, and he just goes, okay, what do you want to talk about? And it just draws a complete silence. And he has realized he has nothing to say, doesn't even know where to start, doesn't know how to talk to his dad. And he's like, okay, so can we get back to the adventure here? And it's one of those, it's kind of played for laughs, but it's like this brutally heartbreaking moment of character.
And that's why I cried 7 times watching The Fabelmans. I know, which if you've not watched it, it's just, oh my God, Stephen, I understand all your movies now. Like every single theme, every single energy. Like it's,
I mean, it is sort of
it's the key.
unofficially
it's like he
the
released the
autobiography.
key to his psyche. I mean, definitely, right? Like, or at least that's how it feels. I have a question for you, Austin, because I know you have to head off in a bit.
Yeah,
Why
sorry
do
to be
I
both
think...
late and then leaving early.
No, you're good. This is a very specific question for you. Why do I think when I'm playing this game that the music is amazingly responsive? Is it just because I know that music so well that I notice it? Or is it doing
responsive, like shit? From an integration standpoint?
I feel like fucking Williams is sat behind me watching me play and going, oh shit, quick, strings. Like I feel that, and is it just because it's just familiar to me, so I hear it more, or is there some cleverer stuff that you think is going on there?
So my pal Gordy Hab did the score, and I will say, as a preemptive shout out, to him, but preemptive to answering your question, I'm really glad that he was clearly given pretty free license to use the existing indie stuff,
which is so rare. When that first indie, like getting the music, like we don't have the Tron soundtrack in our we do stuff inspired by it, but we don't have that. That music is very hard to get.
By default, it's not. Another famous example of this was a few years ago, 10, 15 years ago, there was that game called James Bond Bloodstone that had literally Daniel Craig and Judi Dench in performance capture, or at least voiceover, and their likenesses and all the rest of it. It was a new story. Like it was not based on an existing Ian Fleming novel or whatever, but it was a new thing. And the composer, Richard Jacques, did not have the rights to the Bond theme in that score. And so he had to try every single way he could possibly make you think you've heard it without actually opening them up to legal liability. And that's pretty common because these rights are potentially controlled by different entities and blah, blah, blah.
This feels decadently able to use the music. Just to having the love theme when the letter...
That's exactly what I was about to say. The moment that for me, because Gordy has done most of the Star Wars games the last 20 years. He's he's half of the composing team on the Respawn games and all the EA like Battlefront and Old Republic, and I mean he's one of several, but he's done by far the most of it. He and I hang out a fair amount, and he was telling me that as of a few years ago, he had written something like 4 times the amount of Star Wars music that John Williams has. It's like over 90 hours at this point, compared to John Williams's like 15 hours or whatever the case. So anyway, all that said, he's kind of built a career out of very faithfully recreating the Williams sound, and so it made me. But usually, he's not given permission to use the themes. And so it occasionally will slip into kind of an uncanny valley where he's nailing it, but then it's like, boy, this would have been where the theme would have appeared. So in that very opening bit where you're in the room with Brody and they don't even say her name. They let the theme do the talking. Yep. I was like, oh man, talk about like a textbook example of why themes can pay dividends, where you just hear that, na, 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 which to me is like maybe my favorite Williams theme he's ever written. It's just the most achingly like 1940s romance. It feels like it could have been right out of Casablanca, And anyway, so that was great. Just as a side note, shout out. That was one of those things that I was like, man, that was just good. I'm so glad that he was given permission to do that. In terms of the interactivity, from what I can tell, it's very location based, but very elegantly cross-fading. So I don't detect much by way of things like when we're here, add this, take that away, because I know they did record this with a fairly traditional orchestra, which means it's basically a track that loops. But that said, they do have these little like stingers every time a guard spots you, and those integrate so well into the score that it always feels like it's just part of the cue, but it's a very clear feedback of I'm being watched right now. And
they're presumably they're syncing those musically, so it does feel like it's on the beat. It feels like it's part of them. Yeah.
And it doesn't clash like it's in a totally random key. I haven't asked him how they do it, but that's
though. Like making it sync to the beat while also timing it well is actually very difficult.
It can be very challenging, especially with streaming music. Yeah, there's some real technical hurdles.
I mean,
forgetting the creative hurdles, of course.
Like even just as a DJ, I can't just play a sound and have it be on beat. It has to be on the right count. Like that. That's hard. I don't even know how they would do that.
Well, the software that most games use, there's two principal ones. One's called WWise, usually just call it Wise, and the other one's called Fmod. There's so-called music engines or music middleware. They can do all this for you. You just tell it what's the BPM of the underlying piece that's playing, and then when you want to add something, you can say things like on the next downbeat or the next beat or at any time or whatever. So that part of it is actually is a checkbox in the software. The key is if it actually still sounds like music when all of that fires. Yeah. And that's really easy if it's very like EDM-y and super predictable and everything's moving in a very on the beat kind of way. But the Indiana Jones, the John Williams thing doesn't really move like that at all, which exponentially makes it harder. So I agree. It feels very responsive. And things like, there's little flourishes that I noticed come in. You'll be in a thing where there's like a suspense cue, like a very understated, just like, strings very ambiently giving you the sense that you're in like a restricted area where guards will attack you if they see you. Your costume doesn't work here kind of thing. It's very kind of game design 101. We want to make sure this environment feels more dangerous than the rest. And there's a little recurring bit where you'll jump on a guy, you'll beat the shit out of him, knock him out. And he has this little like thing that comes in that's like 10 seconds long. It's very indie and very Williams, but it usually is a one and done. You knocked him out and the moment is over. Because one of my pet peeves is when we do these state-driven music systems where, okay, we have suspense. We're in the suspense state, which means we're in danger, but no one is actively attacking us. And then we'll flip over into like combat state when someone has actually taken, like we've taken damage or we've inflicted damage. Usually that's the trigger for that. But what happens is in these games where you can do really quick takedowns, it goes combat. And then by the time you've registered the music change, the combat is over because it wasn't a fight. It was a takedown. And it can be quite challenging
for that. Yeah.
Well, it should.
Or that should stay in suspense mode.
Yeah, I usually advocate on those kinds of systems. Let's put a minimum threshold of like a long amount of time in combat that represents like a best guess that we're actually going to be in combat for a minimum amount of time, because those it's like driving onto the on-ramp of a highway and then just immediately bulldozing through the wall in order to try to get off the highway instantly. It's a mess. And this has, it seems like there's a stinger that is purposefully built to address this problem, because it always feels like a flourish befitting the takedown, but it doesn't feel the beginning of a combat encounter. And I keep meaning to text Gordy to see if I'm imagining how that was implemented, because it's so effective. It really feels like it scored what happened. It didn't score a thing that might have happened but didn't.
It sounds like a lot of what you're describing is, as is often the case in games, it's not so much about technology as it is someone very skilled who knows what they're fucking doing, and someone who, as you say here specifically, has studied one composer's work more so than probably anyone ever will, and knows exactly where to put those moments and how to make that work.
The reason that I mentioned that I'm not a huge indie fan, which again, that's not to say I don't think they're good movies. I recognize they're very good. They're just not the kind of thing that like evokes my fandom, is all it is. You're
saying you weren't a boy growing up in the 80s.
I do feel like I mean, I love Lord of the Rings, and I was a fan of Lord of the Rings from when I watched it when I was like 10 or whatever the fuck. It's just something about Indiana Jones was not. Yeah, I had to watch it a lot later. They came out before I was alive,
Harrison Ford's good, but I feel like a better actor will
Viggo
come along
Mortensen.
one day who will take over. Viggo Mortensen.
I had him printed out on the front of all my school books and shit. But so everything you're talking about, including score, means very little to me in terms of like, I don't even really like, I understand Indy as a character and like him, but yeah, that doesn't appeal to me in any way. And yet I still really, really like this game. And that I think that like the systems, even without Indiana Jones being there, which I recognize brings a lot of charm, he is a very, very like uniquely charming character. Like I also love that, like you say, he's very smart, but he's also stupid in how brash he is. He will run off and fucking do something without hesitating because he's so eager to do the thing. Like he is. He's a very passionate nerd, and it's a fun character to play a game with. But the game, in terms of just game design, is so good that it is not being carried by that IP. And I have no huge affection for that IP, and I still think this is one of my favorite games that I've played this year. Like you don't need to be an Indiana Jones fan to like it.
This goes back to intent, and this is a conversation I've had a lot with actors over the years of like, it doesn't always matter what the intent is as long as you have one, because the intent will drive consistency. So when an actor comes up with like a backstory for their character that I don't care about or know, it doesn't really matter because it'll just guide a million little choices that will then play well together. And I think the same is often true of like game design. Is so often if your intent when you start making a video game is, I want to make a game in this genre that does well and makes me lots of money, you're going to be limited in your capacity to make good choices. IP, again, I think I've even talked about this on the show. It's so useful as like a North Star to be running
framework,
towards. And you will, and it doesn't, to an extent, again, it doesn't matter. If you sat down and went, I want to make the greatest fucking Golden Girls game ever, you would make choices that were consistent with each other and pull towards that grander purpose, and it wouldn't matter what the IP was in the end. It's I remember when, I can't talk about that on the air. Shit. I'll tell that story later to you. But no, I think knowing what you're moving towards and having that intent is so valuable in terms of making good video games. I think IP is an amazingly useful shortcut to that. And again, to bring it back to me, because I keep doing that on this call especially, like, Tron's great for this as well, because I know what Tron is. I know what I want to do in a Tron world. There's my North Star. We'll run towards it. And you kind of can't help but make something that feels different to other games, because no other game is trying to run towards that same star you are. And I feel like that's what happened here with this. It's not always the case with that. There's plenty of IP games that do feel like a game with the IP stuck on it. The ones that are good and the ones that I think have staying power, the good ones do exactly what this is, which is, you're not the biggest. I'm kind of half the way between the two of you. Like, I like Indiana Jones, and that I think the score's incredible, but like, I'm not like a fanboy. I watch it every few years when it's on TV. I went and watched Raiders immediately, like at the weekend after playing it, because I was a fan. I'm more of a fan of Indiana Jones after playing this game than I was before.
There's always a sign that something is good. It makes you go, I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
Like that's always.
I want to go watch that movie. Yeah. This is cool, and I want to see which notes they're pulling from these movies that I'm responding well to, because I don't have that photographic memory of the movies. I don't know what's in them.
Austin, do you have to leave?
I do have to leave.
Thanks for your little drive-by play watch. Listen, you thought you'd do.
Yeah.
Great, you can still be bothered to show up.
Wow. Yeah. Oh, we got him for 20 minutes. Wow.
Oh, he's really in high demand.
there's I will leave you with another Troy praising story from when we were working on Stray Gods. To your point, Mike, about intent, in a way, the intent doesn't matter. It's the very fact of having intent that adds so much. There was a moment that was, I learned so much about directing doing those, because he was our performance director. But as we got further in, there were plenty of sessions that I had to direct on my own. And I was able to kind of essentially, you know, because we did like 90 sessions. It was a fuckload of recording sessions. Yeah. And, you know, it was like 45 of those. I mostly just sat silently in the co-pilot seat. I would weigh in musically to address music specific questions, but everything about the performance and the creation of the characters, he was the driver's seat on. But there was a moment where one of our actors, I can't even remember which one, but they said, they pitched like a backstory concept or an underlying subtext kind of motivation for the moment or something along those lines. And they said, I think that in this moment, you know, my character, the reason why they want to do this is because of this. And Troy goes, fantastic. Like, okay, go with that. Let's run with that. And I remember it pinged for me because it really kind of ran contrary to something that was going to come later or whatever it was. So I jumped in. I said, let me just plant a seed why I think we should maybe re-look at that or whatever. And we talked about it. As soon as the session's over, my phone rings. Troy calls me. He goes, so please don't ever do that again.
Yeah.
It
doesn't matter.
He goes, yeah. It doesn't matter. He goes, it doesn't matter if it's wrong. He goes, it's because it wasn't so wrong that it's like turning the story into nonsense. He goes, because speaking as an actor, when there's a thing that I feel like it clicks and it makes it make sense to me.
It makes it work in that scene.
You don't take that away from me. And I was like,
you gotta pick your hat. You got to find a hat that works for the character and go.
It was such a light bulb moment. I was like, fuck, you're so right. I was so apologetic because I was like, oh man, in hindsight, that was so dumb of me. You're so right. But it was just, I needed to have that moment of realize it, just to get inside the actor's head in a way that it was new to me. I'm used to working in the more abstract world of talking to like instrumentalists and saying things like, you know, this should be more forceful, and then they play it a certain way or whatever. But speaking directly to actors about how they sing and all was a little novel. And
you just have to find a way to get them to give you the result that they want. It doesn't matter so much.
Often being a director is just pretending to have an intent in the moment to someone's security in their own choices. Like sincerely, like that's all directing is. It's just intent at that higher scale.
I leave you to your fire alarm or whatever I'm hearing.
Don't die. That was the
catch
last
you later.
Happy New Year,
chat amongst yourselves. Goodbye. Likewise. Okay, yeah, you too.
I was gonna say.
Is that a train here coming through? Are you hearing a train?
No. That was definitely. Oh no. I think his fire alarm. I think it actually was. That's why I said don't die.
He's literally a drunk. Okay. Don't die, Austin. And that's the last 3 episodes of Austin.
Exactly.
He died doing what he loved, podcasting.
Play, watch, listen. 4 years in. Yeah. Whoa, I think we're actually at 4 years now. Yeah, our first episode was 2020 December. That's crazy. How many hours have we had conversations for?
I love it.
Me too. They'll claw this show out of my dying hands. If you and Austin both left, I would be so upset. It would make my weeks worse. But I was going to talk about Layers Deep. I'm not game director on Layers Deep, but one of the first things that I did when I joined was ask them what their pillars are. And a very fun thing about the way that we're making that game is that we have a technical director, we have an art director, and we have a narrative director, and that's fucking it. So it's just the three of us owning each of the pillars. So I basically was like, let's sit down and make a board of what is the core principle of each of these pillars. Mine's really easy. It's just one word. So everything narrative has to drive towards that one word. That is my point. That is what I'm trying to say. Every narrative thing, if I can't make it hone in on that exact theme, it should be cut or rewritten. I have them try and do the same exact thing with art and with technical direction, design, like even gameplay, so that each of us, when we're building out what the game looks like, are like, these are our 3 North Stars. Ideally, they overlap with each other as much as they possibly can, and we like find ideas that do that.
The Big Dipper, they form into a constellation.
Exactly, ideally. Just a perfect Triforce. To make sure that you are constantly, because we don't have IP, obviously, we just have this thing that we're making, but to make sure that like...
You have to come up with the the thing.
Yeah.
The thing of what
and I think
you're
it's
making.
super
Yeah,
easy if you do that from the start, instead of like scrambling to be like, here, maybe this is the design core for this. I'm like, no, we make our pillars early and we stick to our pillars. And that's the thing I just took from working at Santa Monica Studio, is that they're really specific about what are the exact pillars of the game and how do they relate to which departments, and how are you making sure that you are always looking towards those stars. If you ever are like, oh, how about this thing? Does it align with one of those pillars? If not, it's not right for our game. It can be a great idea, but it doesn't fit here. Like, it has to be all pushing in that direction all the time. It makes it decision making a lot easier, where you don't have IP to rely on. It makes you have like a cohesive vision / brand. Like, it makes a lot of facets of game design a lot easier if you're like, these are my fucking things. And I know some studios have more than 3. SMS only had 3. Like, works great for us that that's the 3 that we have. And it makes the sandbox of working on new IP also less scary.
I think as well, one of the things I anticipate, and I don't know if I'm fully right here, but one of the things I'm fascinated to check in with you on when we're recording this podcast 4 more years from now, one of the things I'm fascinated to check in with you on is, I think you're in a really uniquely cool position where a lot of the stuff you've learned in the AAA world is specifically as forcefully done as it is because of scale, because you have to maintain, like, the great thing about the idea of pillars is that they compress data, they compress information. Essentially, once Corey's worked out what those pillars are, he doesn't have to be in the room, and he knows that to an extent everyone can just look to the pillars and knows. And obviously that's not the case. He's always around. You know what I mean? Like, there's
but that is definitely not the way 600 people work.
But there's still, the idea is it's compressed data. It's a distillation of vision and intent, right? You could write a book about what you're going for. Yeah, but that's really powerful because the smaller the data packet, the more transmissible it is, right? So like, that information can get around and be shared. If you wrote a 200-page essay about what you were trying to achieve with a narrative, you would rightly know nobody was ever going to fucking read it, and that information wouldn't transfer at all. Whereas if you can convey, as you said, in a simple idea, you're good. What I think is going to be really interesting, and what I suspect you're going to experience, is all those systems that create hopefully vague alignment in the AAA space. If you apply them with the same rigor in the indie space, they are very powerful tools because of the number of people. It's like a fruit concentrate. It's just condensed. It's the same idea, but you're not diluting it across such a large team.
True. Or diluting it across the amount of systems in the game. Like, because it's an indie game, when you have 3 people, it has to fundamentally be a lot simpler. Like, it's just a reality.
I think you're going to find that you're doing a lot of the same thinking and communication approaches you did in AAA, but to surprisingly, magically awesome power that you didn't anticipate. That's my assumption. I think you'll be surprised by how much those tricks work when they're in a smaller team, because that's honestly what our tricks are mostly, is the way we develop our stuff, the way we're able to hit kind of consistency that we do, and the kind of the rhythm of release that we do, is because we basically do a lot of the same processes as much bigger studios, but because we're so much smaller, we can just efficiently get through that very quickly. I'm interested to see. I think you're going to bring a lot of that thinking to that team, and I think that's really. I'm excited to see how that plays out. I think
it's already a thing. I'm already really enjoying it. It's already a thing where, like, making AAA games is really fucking hard, right? Like, I know we always say that, but trying to communicate an idea, even about one level, to a team of even 30 people is really fucking hard. Like, communication. I would actually say the biggest flaw in a lot of AAA is communication. Like, there are so many communication problems that are so hard to alleviate. When there are 3 of us, like, it's like, I think I've said this before, the biggest change that I've already felt, outside of way less meetings and way less complications, and is really that if one of us has an idea, the others go, yeah, cool. If you have an idea in AAA, you have to make a presentation, full with slideshows. You present it to a room of people. They go, let me talk to this person, and then it gets passed up through the ICs, and then it goes to the directors, maybe, and then they say no, and that process took 4 fucking weeks. Like, it's so...
You have to deprogram people a little bit. Whenever we've hired out of AAA, there's always this weird month with new people who just come from AAA where you kind of have to say to them, like, you're allowed to
have ideas.
Just tell me I'm wrong about this and come up with something cooler.
Yeah.
And it always takes people a little while to kind of get into that mindset, for sure.
Yeah,
but you're right, it's communication. It always comes down. Game development is a strand game, right? It's all about those connections.
It really is. It's also just so many bottlenecks. Like, I'm not sure if every studio is this way, but I imagine that it is. And I guess a lot of creative projects, when you're not working with 3 people, are just so many bottlenecks.
It's an inevitability of any complex task with enough stakeholders. It's just an inevitable outcome of that scale.
Yeah. Huge pain in the butt.
It even comes, honestly, there's still, like, we're a team of 20 now. There's still challenges to that. There's still things that can get blocked. But yeah.
20's still, like, if it would be difficult for you to have a meeting and hear everybody and to have everybody be heard, you are going to have communication problems. Like, imagine 20 people in a room trying to have a conversation about one thing. If that would be difficult, it's difficult no matter what. 3 people, very easy. 5 people, still pretty easy. But the minute you even get to 10, you go, okay, there's going to be some communication strain because that's 10
That's
people.
where we had to, 10 was where we as a team had to start consciously. Until that point, we just didn't hire our souls and our communication just kind of worked up to 10 people. Once we crossed that line into 10 people, we still didn't have any arseholes, but now there were communication challenges for exactly the reason you're saying.
Yep.
Yeah. Are you, well, I guess maybe that's not something you want to talk about. I don't know, are you planning on growing at all, or is this kind of the size you're going to be?
We currently have no plans to. Our composers are external, or at least the people doing the soundtrack, they are external, but otherwise, no. I would love to keep it with just the 3 of us.
Can't wait to see how it goes. Like, I think you're genuinely going to do something really cool.
I hope so too. It's been fun already. We'll have our own technical limitations and budget limitations. Obviously, that's a really tough thing. One other thing that I want to say that I think is like what drew me to wanting to work on Layers Deep, that I actually think is consistently very important in the indie space in a way that a lot of people who are trying to break in maybe don't consider, and that became very obvious to me because of media background, is you can see a screenshot of Layers Deep and you know what it is. Not only do you see a screenshot and understand the identity of the thing, that it is unique, you also look at it, just a 2-second GIF, and go, I know what that game is. And I feel like being able to do that as a marketing tool is so valuable. The game that really stood out to me for that particular thing, in that like it blew up as an indie success because it was so digestible, is Dream Daddy, the game that the Game Grumps published. It's a dating simulator where you date dads, and it's called Dream Daddy, and every screenshot of that game you see, you go, got it, understand exactly what the game is. Meaning that they don't really have to market it to you, they just have to share it. And like, if you have a really distinct identity and you can understand even what the gameplay is likely going to be, it doesn't mean you're generic. It means that you have a very good pitch every time you post a screenshot. And I love that particular thing. That's like, you guys figured out the identity. I'm happy to be a part of this. Like, that's the hardest part. Like, Stardew Valley does a really good job of that. You see Stardew Valley, you know exactly what the fucking game is. Like, everything is very
It's
obvious.
why I genuinely just dismiss a lot of the nonsense you hear about, like, AI is going to take over, because AI can't do that.
True.
That's something that I've never seen an AI-generated image that looked anything
unique,
that looked like it had an identity or unique, because it can't be. It's limited to what's gone before, right? So, yeah, I think I completely agree.
I guess,
cool. And again, somewhere where IP also kind of helps.
Sorry, go ahead.
It's somewhere else where IP is a convenient shortcut, but like doing that with an original thing is always really. I think to an extent, I feel like that's kind of one of the secrets of Thomas Was Alone's success, is that we just owned the concept of rectangle.
Totally.
Like, even now, if anyone posts up like placeholder, like a bit of like a demo of a prototype, and it's a rectangle, someone in the comments is going to be like, "Oh, you're making Thomas Was Alone." And that does infuriate me, obviously. But at the same time, like, the branding that we own a rectangle as a concept is kind of crazy.
Huge for you. And you've never used it again. Where's Thomas Was Alone 2?
That's because I got class. Never liked the acronym. The acronym holds us back on Thomas
Was Alone 2.
Do your letters.
What? What's wrong?
The acronym of Thomas Was Alone 2.
Oh, yeah. No, that's good. You should do that. But also, he can't be alone twice. Thomas was loved.
I know and will tell you what I would call the sequel, and I think it's both a brilliant idea and a terrible, terrible idea that the internet would get very angry.
Is it Thomas Was Alonerer? Thomas Was Alonest.
I like that.
You're right. You're welcome. Anytime.
That's good. Thank you. I can tell you. Yeah, no. This is what I expect from a narrative director.
I got you anytime. Yeah, that's what you should expect from Layers Deep, everybody. But when we even talking about pillars, that is a reason that I think indie is strong. We've had these conversations about what best game direction means. That is, God damn it. Game direction, I think, is the ability to communicate with teams effectively and make sure that you are always working towards that North Star. That is what makes good game direction. Like, I think Alan Wake 2, some of the best game direction I've ever seen. Like, it's so, every single system feeds towards this exact particular vision. You play 5 minutes of that game and you are getting the experience that 12 hours of that game will provide. And I think that's genuinely probably harder for AAA than it is for an indie title.
100%.
But they never nominate
100%.
indie titles because we know that the feat is easier. Like, it's probably that, like, the scope of a AAA game, like maybe the media.
I just think director means a fundamental. Like, I call myself a game director because there's not another, but my job is fundamentally different to Sam Lake's job. Like, that is a different job in a million ways, like, and a completely different skill set. I'm sure he would humbly say there's actually a lot more similarities than I realize, but I think it's probably I think it's a harder job, and I'd like those people to keep getting the awards for that. I think directing at my level is easy mode.
I don't like, not to discredit you, easy mode maybe not, like, your job is still obviously very hard because
right, it's like medium. It's like,
but you also have the challenge of trying, because of the scale that you're at, of trying to make sure people can eat. Like, you don't have to really worry about that so much when you're directing a AAA game.
I don't know though. Like, I imagine. Well, maybe not.
Maybe
not. I think there's a responsibility always. I think people probably always. I think you feel the responsibility of directing a AAA game in that level. There's jobs that depend on me being good at my job. I think that's true of any director at any level.
It's true. I will actually say, for my time working in AAA, I don't doubt that I'll do it again one day. The thing that surprised me the most, and obviously I can only speak to one studio, is, this is just a thing that I had no concept of, is how many decisions are made in order to make the team happy. How important the happiness of the team is to many decisions, is making sure that this department feels heard and that these people don't feel this way, because you cannot lose the talent and without suffering tremendously. And when you work at a studio like that, there are people of varying degrees of experience, like across the board. Some people who had only previously had internships, some people who've worked on tons of AAA games. Like, it's a huge swath of experience. But even when you've trained someone for a month or whatever to work on a AAA game, which is how long the onboarding process itself is very difficult and very expensive, you just do not want to have to go through the fucking hiring process. Like, you just want to keep those people. So there are so many calls that are made to make sure the team feels heard, is being listened to, that everyone who has all of that expertise that they are offering to the studio will stay and be excited about the thing they're making. Like, I had no concept of that before working in dev at all.
That's the entire value of a team of making games. Like, I mean, it just the example of the music conversation with Austin there, of like, everything he was describing is technologically available to everyone working in the world of music and games. The reason it's so good in Indiana Jones is there's a guy who's been doing it for 20 years.
Yeah.
Like, that's fundamentally, and you can't buy that off an asset store or off a shelf. Like, people, I remember a very early episode of this show, and I remember it because it was really interesting to me as a question you asked. I think we were talking about game budgeting, and this was 4 years ago. You hadn't thought about this stuff as much. And I remember you being surprised when we were talking about it. I was like, of course, the most expensive thing is people.
Yeah.
And I remember that being kind of a surprising kind of observation to you.
I think I may have asked what makes games so expensive, and it is just people.
Yeah.
It's salaries.
And I think that's the thing that I think, yeah, as you say, you can't work in games and not notice that that's where all the value is.
Yeah.
And it's a very immediate tell from me when I'm talking to people who work in like the corporate end of games, shall we say, when they don't realize that that's where all of the value is. It's always the people.
It's the people who've joined the project, who are excited about the project.
Yeah.
And who you don't want to.
And even if you weren't like a nice person, even if you didn't care about anyone on an emotional level, even then, just on cold hard cash, the employees are still the most valuable thing in the room. And it's why a lot of choices you see play out in the games industry with various things that have happened over the years just don't make sense if you've actually ever worked in video games.
Great point.
They're not choices a professional would make.
That's a great point. But Merry Christmas, everyone. Happy New Year, Happy Holidays, whatever it is that you celebrate. We will see you back on January 3rd. I'm